Hi, Rama. It's week 12, day 2 of our Bible narrative reading plan. Today we're in Joshua chapters 7 and 8. Today we have the tragic story of the sin of Achan. If you remember, yesterday we saw the fall of Jericho. We saw the wonderful victory at Jericho, and we saw at the end of chapter 6, verse 27, it said, "So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land." And this is one of those cases where the chapter divisions and the verse divisions, they're helpful, but it also causes us to sometimes miss what the narrator is doing in the story, because if you just keep reading, you notice the change in tone. So you go from Joshua's fame spreading to all the land. It says, but the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. You remember that God had told Joshua, he had told Israel that Jericho was going to be set apart. It was going to be consecrated for the Lord. It was going to be devoted to destruction. It was the first fruits. It was an offering to God, that because God goes before Israel and God is fighting the battles for Israel, that God gets the first fruits from these victories. And he tells them that in the future they will have fruit from the battle. They will have the benefits. They will have the spoils of war. But here with Jericho, he told them, don't touch the consecrated things. But what do we see in chapter 7? The narrator begins the chapter telling us that they broke faith in regard to the devoted things. And then we see that they go to battle, that Joshua sends spies up to Ai, a community nearby Jericho, and he tells them to go and spy out the land. And the people come back and say, hey, we don't even have to send all of our men. This is going to be an easy victory. And they go to battle, and they are soundly defeated. Some of Israel's soldiers actually die. And so Joshua falls upon his face on the Lord. He doesn't understand what's happening, and he's crying out to God. He almost sounds the way that Israel sounded when they were wandering in the wilderness and complaining against God. Joshua says, would that we had been content to dwell beyond the Jordan. But God has given them the promised land. He's told them that they're going to occupy the promised land. And Joshua is distraught. He doesn't understand why they have been defeated at Ai just after they had won victory at Jericho. But then God tells him in chapter 7, verse 10, he says, get up. Why have you fallen on your face? Israel has sinned. And so God lays out this process for how he's going to reveal to them who has sinned. And you follow along in the chapter, and we realize that it is a man named Achan. Achan has taken the devoted things. He has seen some of the cloak, the beautiful cloak, and the silver and the gold. And notice what it says, chapter 7, verse 20 and 21. He says, when I saw these things, I coveted them and I took them. You see this process. He sees, he covets in his heart, and he takes. That's the same process that we see in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve and their sin. That's the process that James tells us about, of how we see things and then we covet them in our heart. And then once that sin has taken root in our heart, we act upon it and it brings forth death. This is what happens in the life of Achan. So Achan must pay the consequences, but Achan doesn't pay the consequences alone. His entire family suffers for his sin. All of his livestock, all of his wealth, all of his property, the things that he thought he was adding to, he thought that he was building up wealth by taking from the wealth of Jericho. Now he's losing it all. He's losing his family. He's losing his very life. And so Achan is a painful, painful reminder that our sin is never truly private. Our sin never affects only us. When we choose to sin, it has vast consequences, more often more vast than we even realize at the time. And so the story of Achan is a painful reminder of the severity of sin. We know that our sin brings consequences and that God is just, and he will ultimately deliver punishment for those who sin. But then we continue in chapter 8, and we see that now the time has arisen that they can go back and conquer Ai, because God is on their side. He has told them, now the sin has been removed from your camp. And so they go, and you read the story there in chapter 8, but they have victory. And notice what happens at the end of the chapter. Joshua renews the covenant. He writes again the words that Moses has told them, and they renew the covenant among them, vowing to live as God's people, honoring God by remembering that obedience brings blessings, disobedience brings consequences, and we see that played out painfully in the life of the nation of Israel and in the family of Achan. Here's a summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.